All right, I think we should be good to go.
All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody that is here live as well as watching the recording. I'm Rochelle Savitz, and I am an associate professor at East Carolina University, but more importantly, president of our wonderful organization, Literacy in the Discipline 612. Today, we are offering a great session, a panel discussion really connected to literacy policy and the impact on educators, on teacher educators and higher ed, and all the things that we kind of need to consider and think about, and ideas of what we can do by our newly formed policy and advocacy committee. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and they're going to talk about different things, but have lots of conversation in between to share perspectives and ask questions, as well as from people that are attending. Take it away, Ian.
Everybody, my name is Ian O'Byrne. I am an associate professor of literacy education here at the College of Charleston. I am excited to be here with my two brilliant colleagues.
Hey everyone, I am Brooke Harden, and I am an assistant professor of elementary education at the University of South Carolina Upstate. I'm thrilled to be here and part of Literacy in the Disciplines as well.
Hey y'all, I am Tori Young. I teach social studies in upstate South Carolina. I've been teaching for 5 years now, and I really enjoy discussing policy with my peers and with my students and getting to share that with you guys.
So we're thankful for you being here or watching this at a later date. This topic is very important to us, and I think it's very important to you if you're following along with us. We ask that you approach this as a learner. Many times people don't want to think deeply about topics like this because they come in with their own specific stances. So we want to make sure that you listen and learn along with all of us, potentially meet discomfort with curiosity and openness. Please, as you review this or at a later date, ask for clarification and don't put your own insight into any things that are said. We believe that all voices count, and so there's a need to think about what reasoning. I have people coming in the room right now. All voices count. Offer reasoning behind your thinking. Please try to support, but then also in this, we're going to try and expect some non-closure. This is going to be, as we say oftentimes in our classroom, a wicked problem at times, and it's hard to understand how multi-threaded it is and how it might go against some of our thought processes. So I want to talk quickly about what is advocacy. When we think about advocacy, there are different avenues or venues that we might head. In our classes with students, when we advise political groups, when we advise our organizations, we might have policy briefs. Some of us get involved in lobbying. We could talk a little bit more about what that might look like. Advocacy is where we're trying to organize forces and petition. If we're looking at the spectrum of cooperation to confrontation, it's leaning to the confrontation side. I know that many times as educators, we don't like thinking about confrontation, but it's thinking about more forward-leaning action. And then when we look at advocacy as opposed to activism, we're thinking about providing evidence to support our findings as opposed to thinking about just general interests or values. So advocacy is we are working with processes to try and influence decision makers. We're trying to fight for social change. We might be trying to push public attitudes, public perceptions, mobilize resources, help inform colleagues, friends, families, students, ourselves about different behaviors. We're going to try and do these things to positively affect the lives of marginalized or perhaps disadvantaged individuals. But mostly we're trying to speak up and draw attention to an issue. So put simply, we're thinking about power. We're thinking about topics of power and influencing or changing these relationships of power as they interact with other individuals. And we just try to support people that are around us. I will hand it over to my colleague, Tori.
Yeah, so specifically looking at advocacy in the secondary social studies classroom, because that's sort of where my realm of reference is. Policy in secondary schools, we know, is coming from lots of different layers. Of course, we've got federal policies. We've all remember No Child Left Behind. I am a product of that federal policy, and looking at how they can impact, the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act and providing healthier lunches or free and reduced lunches. But when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to the things that impact us mostly as teachers, that's going to be straight from the 10th Amendment. That's our state policies. So a lot of time when we're looking at policy in secondary schools, looking at our state policies, looking at what our local school boards and school districts are doing is where we have a lot more input and impact. And that's why we're kind of focusing today on South Carolina schools with policy, because if we're going to sit here and talk about policy as a whole, we would have to break down every single state and every single difference, and that's very difficult and very unique for each one. So when we're looking at how policy impacts curriculum, there is some good and some evil. Again, social studies teacher, I'm always gonna, play devil's advocate. So if you're one side or the other, I'm gonna push for both for you to make you think outside the box a little bit. So when we think of how policy can support our curriculum, think of how it creates uniformity across schools. Whether you're going from one school to another, I've recently transferred high schools. It's been nice to not have to relearn standards and curriculum all over again. I've had that uniformity, and same for our students that are transferring within the state. It makes that move a whole lot easier for them as well. You get more citizen input because of this, so we get to, vote on things, talk to our school boards. That's a nice democratic right that we have when it comes to our policy. And we also have more equitable access through policies. We all know we got some ways to go with equity in our school system, but definitely a lot better than we were, 50 years ago. But we still have a lot of barriers, and that's what brings up our conversation. So when we look at things like standardized testing, when we
sorry.
look at, you're good. Standardized testing, we look at funding, we look at all these issues that prevent proper curriculum from getting to our students, that sort of maybe preventing you from teaching the material that you feel is important to teach to that group of students, or getting diverse voices in your classroom, or getting to use resources that you need. I know some districts block what materials you can get at the library. Sometimes firewalls on the internet pop up and you can no longer access certain resources because I was teaching World War I. I had a great resource I could use, and when my kids went to log in, it couldn't access it because it had weapons and death, which is a lot of social studies and history. So we're kind of limited in those ways sometimes. So kind of just being aware of the good and the bad as we're entering this. So when we're going with social studies and we're confronting this policy issue, we have the topic of how do we teach true history in social studies and English especially. We've faced a lot of issues when it comes to critical race theory and integrating, biases in our teaching. When you're teaching a true history, though, you're not integrating those biases. You're teaching what truly happened. It's very factual based. It's very messy. It's history. Humans have not changed over time. If you open a newspaper and see craziness now, if you open a newspaper 100 years ago, it was just as crazy. So when we look at those issues, so use primary sources, use secondary sources to sort of support you, bring in the facts and leaving out your opinion. If you have sort of a way you want to provide true history to your students, full resources that will support, because it's going to give them multiple perspectives, make their voices feel heard and have more diverse voices, help them see themselves in the history, and just create more relevancy to today to sort of tie back and go, hey, actually, we're not that different than people that lived hundreds of years before us. And that's going to make it a lot more meaningful and engaging for them. When we look at true history versus how we see history presented, usually if you just open up our textbooks, resources that are issued to us, I teach U.S. history, so I have a lot of U.S. history examples. A lot of times it's, hey, we're at the war of the Middle East because 9/11 happened and we got to fight terrorism. And they put that terrorism word in bold and it's highlighted, and that's it, and we move on. If you look at the history of the United States intervening in the Middle East, you might see a little more tensions on both sides. If you look at the Civil War, we know there's a lot more depth as we have expanded our borders westward, as we encountered other groups. We had the expansion of slavery and issues. If you open the textbook, it just says, hey, state rights, and a nice little outcome of the Civil War was we abolished slavery. They don't really tie in all of the background to show the true side of the messiness, again, of history. It's not just good versus bad. There's wrongs on both sides. You may be able to pick who the right side is for you, and that's great, but acknowledging rights and wrongs for both. And that's true history, is giving them all of those options to choose for themselves, because that's what's going to make them be able to address policy in the future and make those decisions for themselves, building those skills.
Quick question, Tori, do you feel like
Yeah.
students want that?
Specifically working with adolescents, I do see that need for that. Either a lot of times they feel like it's over their head, so sometimes we got to break it down. But a lot of times they want that autonomy. They want that chance to feel heard, and to feel kind of right. In a lot of these situations, they start to realize they're all correct, as long as they can back themselves up with facts. And so that's what we really focus on, is you can make any point. I will give you full credit. You just got to have a fact to back it up. And sort of bring in that sort of research side of policy and advocacy, and not just the beliefs. We do focus on, when I teach government, of trying to figure out what your values and beliefs are, and recognizing those as different from facts, and how they work together, and how to separate them, sort of find where you lie politically, what our outside influences are. But at the end of the day, a lot of these young adults know they're about to vote. They feel like they're adults, right? And they feel like they're being silenced because they don't get to go out and vote. They don't get to make all these decisions. They're all made for themselves. So to have a chance to actually voice their opinion, get their background heard, usually ends up building a lot of community in the classroom.
Thank you for that.
So if you're thinking about trying to integrate true history into your curriculum, trying to step away from just what your textbook has, it's important to sort of look out for primary sources that you can use to support, even if it's just an excerpt. You don't have to use the whole thing, a whole letter from a diary, anything. But using those primary sources to back things up, showing that it's truly written in history and it's not just something out of a random book. If you teach with a standardized test, if you have end of course exams, AP exams especially, pull sources from those past exams to fit them into whatever history you're trying to get your kids to dig into. One thing about, especially with sensitive topics, if you are pulling a political cartoon or a speech that came, if you're pulling it from a standardized test from your state or from the College Board, it's really hard for administration or parents to argue against that, because it's in the standards. It's what you're going towards, which goes into tying everything back to the standards very clearly. Don't try to find a loosey-goosey way around it. That's not going to go really well, but we've all done it. We've all tried. But it's difficult to argue if you are following the rules and policies already in place to discuss these things. So it takes a little time, it takes some effort. But if you are able to tie those in, you can start to really allow discussion to expand with your students, because you have that safety net. So let them talk about the tough topics. It's really scary at first, because especially with adolescents, whether it's a 11-year-old going to handle a topic different from a 17-year-old, just sort of getting your feet wet, starting out with something a little simpler, building that sort of classroom conversation into the tougher topics. But they'll surprise you. They have some really interesting thoughts and perspectives. They're learning a lot just outside of what they hear from your classroom, not just what they hear from their parents, but from social media, from friends. They're getting a lot of different perspectives to bring in and talk about. And it gives you a chance to point out not whether you disagree or not, but point out any misconceptions that we know pop up a lot about cultures and histories and policy that comes through social media a lot. If you have a rough classroom, I know I've had some that we just don't talk about certain topics together. It's just not going to go well. And it happens sometimes. Still don't silence those students. Again, they feel like they need to be heard. Get them their voices and let them feel validated. That's where I start doing independent reflections, whether it's just an exit ticket about what their perspective was on something we talked about today. And relating it personally to them, give them intentional feedback. Let them know they're heard. Let them know where you think they make good points, where they agree, where they maybe need to bring more facts into their argument. That's going to help a lot. And when you see policy changes, discuss them. I know we got a new security system going in this year, and that brought a lot of different opinions to the ground. And kids did not want to walk through metal detectors or anything throughout the day. But they were all compliant. They were all they handled it well. And when they had questions, instead of just shutting them down and saying, get over it, this is how it is, because that's going to bring a level of apathy and grow apathetic voters in the future if you just tell them whatever. Acknowledge that change, explain why, and let them ask questions. I had a coworker that her students had really good questions about why are we putting this system in place and what's the good and bad about it. And she brought in the head of security for the district and had them talk about it. Let them ask him questions and really get into the nitty gritty. And it was actually very meaningful. A lot of kids walked away with good feelings about that conversation and just knowing that they were heard about it.
We have a question from the chat.
Okay.
I believe it is Rochelle Savitz. Rochelle, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or you want us to ask it for you?
I'm happy to unmute. I think that I've been having conversations with teachers, and this idea of, even in high school, do you think that the students are aware that they haven't been taught or know the true history, the full history, the historical perspective, like thinking even of what Americans call Thanksgiving often, do you think the students are aware that they don't know a lot of what's happening there?
Yeah, because that's a great question of like, you don't know what you don't know, right? Um, and so I know I had a bit of that aha moment as I got into high school and started learning history, United States history specifically, of, oh, why they didn't teach us this in elementary school. So I think there is a bit of unawareness because they're shaped a lot about what when it comes to trusting what they're learning about history, they're really trusting their teachers to be teaching them what is true. That's kind of a role we have to take on, a burden we kind of have to carry of that trust. So when it comes to sort of bringing in those extra sources and bring in those other voices, a lot of times when I'm teaching tough topics that have to do with the emancipation of slavery and what that looks like, I'm not the ideal voice to be expressing those sentiments, right? I can express the facts, but I can't really bring out the full history and the true history as well as a role of a white woman in the classroom. So I usually bring in videos and perspectives online of older African-American historians talking about these issues, and they can tie it back into their familial history and their culture. And it's a lot more meaningful when you can bring in those extra voices. And thankfully with technology, we have that ability.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So now we have Dr. Hardin to talk a little bit about diverse inclusive text. How do we make this happen in our classroom?
All right, so I'll first start out with, I didn't build tons of slides, but what I'm going to talk about is actually going to be followed up as well. There's going to be a blog post on the LID blog coming out that covers quite a bit, and may even echo some of what I'm going to talk about here. But so I'll also begin by talking that this is something that I discuss at length with the pre-service and in-service educators that I work with in my role, both as teaching pre-service elementary teacher or students, elementary ed majors, and then also teaching graduate students who oftentimes are anywhere from pre-K teachers to high school teachers, and they're part of a graduate program that I teach. So, and I do a lot of children's literature, adolescent literature classes. So this is a conversation that I'm engaged in quite often, I feel like. And so I also will say that I always tell students that while we can enter into these conversations about classroom libraries and having diverse and inclusive text, we can enter into those with our personal beliefs. We'll get much further oftentimes if we draw upon some theoretical knowledge as well, and what we know about reading and what we know about connecting with kids and things of that nature, because those things are really hard to argue with just based on my experience. And I think that echoes a lot of what Tori was saying as well, that, you know, if you can go in with, hey, this is this, like these are educational theories, then you get a little further, and people tend to say, okay, it gives them a little bit to think about. So we're having this conversation just recently. This past week, I saw another headline with a South Carolina high school situation where there is a novel in question before a school board. And it deals with race. It was a novel where the race was discussed and firsthand accounts were given in this book. And so, you know, we have policies that are saying that we cannot include text that talk specifically about race, or we're told how they have to discuss race. They can't be anti-American. They can't deal with sexuality. Just lots of different things that we're being told you can have this and you can't have that. And so where I come at this is that when it comes to a classroom library, I think of a classroom library in two ways. And in my own classroom and in those that I'm in most often, there are two types of classroom libraries. There's that library that's like your traditional, wherever those books are shelved or, are available to students to grab for independent reading. And then as a teacher, I've always had my own classroom, my instructional classroom library that I pull my materials from and things like that. And so I think this conversation is pertinent to both of those, quote, spaces in a classroom. And so I always come at this with, one, we have to think of a text. We hear this word diverse. And so several years ago, the International Literacy Association put out a really great series of some continuing ed, some webinars as well that I attended about, okay, yeah, we need diverse books, but what do we do with them? And then also that thinking about this issue of diversity, of that instead of it's along a continuum. And so that what's diverse for me as a white female may not be diverse for a student that I'm teaching, and so on. And so it's not just that this book that centers, about an African-American male or is diverse. It's maybe diverse for me, but it may not be diverse for a student in my classroom. And so I think that's one of the first things that we have to think about, is that when we call the text diverse, we center the book, we center the literature, we don't center the kid. And so I think that's where we have to do that, is we have to center a little bit of the reader as well, and thinking about like, okay, who is this diverse for? And I think there again too, that could be it. There may be a book that features a white female character, and so that's not diverse for me, but it might be for Ian or for someone else as a white male, So I think that's one of the first things to talk about. And then the other thing is going back to some seminal work of Rudine Sims Bishop's idea of mirrors of that text act as mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors. And so we want that for kids. So we want them to see themselves. We want to see their stories, their histories represented in the materials that we use. We also want them to be able to see into the worlds of others. We know that that builds empathy, that builds empathic responses oftentimes, and it deepens content knowledge. Going back to what we say, I know my history. I know my family's history. I don't know everyone else's. So I always draw on that. And then as well, thinking about just a transactional reader response theory, that we all have a different interaction with a book. And so again, this idea that what I make of a text is going to be based on my own experiences, and what someone else makes from that text and the meaning that they draw from it is based on theirs. And I think for those reasons, we say that in order to build critical thinkers, which again, kind of building on what Tori was saying, we don't want kids to be apathetic. We don't want the citizens of our world to be, and in our country to be apathetic. So in order to grow what I consider critical global citizens, we have to be able to see ourselves, but also see into the worlds of others, and have some empathy. So I always draw on those as my theoretical basis for why I am including these materials, and why I'm going to have multiple perspectives of a topic, and why I'm going to have books available to kids. The other thing as well is that just going on that we know that, so talking about a classroom library where kids can pull materials or text for independent reading or just for leisure reading. First of all, I just recently saw something. It was a whole idea of this, just 10 minutes a day, just 10 minutes a day of independent self-selected reading, what it does for all people, from young children to adolescents to even adults. And the idea of it's relaxing, like people's blood pressure goes down when they read something that they've actually chosen themselves and enjoy reading. Their sense often of self and confidence is increased. We know that reading skills are increased with sustained time in text. So vocabulary skills, spelling skills, all of these, reading comprehension, fluency, all of these things that we know we want our students to be, we want them to be successful and we want them to be skilled readers. And so one way to do that is by getting them to read independently. And so in order to motivate them to read independently, there's got to be something on that classroom library shelf or in the classroom library that appeals to them. That's where I feel like that kind of brings me to the recommendations. And so the first thing that I always tell is that we don't just want students to be critical, teachers as well have to be critical. You have to be critical of your content and your materials, and your classroom library. So I always think about looking at my class roster and thinking about, who are these students? I do this as a college professor, that I look at my class roster and I think, okay, I'm going to teach this social studies methods course, and I've got to pull some, text for this. I'm going to select, 6 novels that are young adult novels and I'm going to let everybody choose which one. I've got to offer a choice that could potentially appeal to every student in my undergraduate course or my graduate class. And so I always say, you've got to be reflective. You've got to look at your class roster. Who are your people? Who's your customer? Basically, is kind of the way I look at this. And then look at your materials and say, and be honest, what's missing? Do you have a book? Do you have materials that actually is there equal opportunity there where for everyone to find something where they may see themselves if that's what they want? And they may also see something else as well. So there's both that idea of, do you have texts that are going to act as a mirror for students? And do you also have texts that are going to act as those windows and sliding glass doors? And if not, then it's time to do some shopping. And same thing with, I feel like, that's kind of, and then I also use interest inventories. That can be a little old school, but I think students really enjoy that. But as a teacher, we have to take them seriously as well. So don't just have students complete it. Actually look and see, what do they enjoy? What do they want to read about? What do they watch or listen to in their spare time? Like what interest, where are they? And what's maybe something that they've read before that they enjoyed? What's the worst thing they ever read? And why was it the worst? So I think those are all those things that, again, it's knowing your client. And then I think knowing that, you have standards, but I think from a lot of these perspectives, ELA, social studies, science, all of these, like you've got your standards, but you also have the person in the room. And so being able to appeal to them and also to be accurate. So I think that's my main thing, is that I think our classroom libraries, they have to be accurate and they have to be relevant. For those folks, and I encounter students all the time as pre-service and in-service teachers that are, they're really hesitant and they're scared to, come under fire and to, just basically, quote, get in trouble. I mean, honestly, they don't want to be in the headlines. They don't want to be at a school board meeting, a lot of them. And so I feel I always go back to, okay, well, if you're being challenged, then can you draw on some of this theoretical information? And then also, just like I saw that this particular, I was really impressed. The author of this book that was challenged showed up at this school board meeting in support of this teacher. And I think that's awesome. And so we have sources nationwide. We have sources where, NCTE, the National Council for Teachers of English, they have a whole page where it is about supporting teachers and librarians and others that come up against challenges. There's also the We Need Diverse Books website. They have resources for and it is a step-by-step, like, do this. Have you contacted like you're basically who are your allies? All these different steps for both teachers, librarians, parents who are wanting their students, wanting their kids to be in classrooms where there are inclusive and comprehensive libraries. And so I feel like that we have resources out there. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere for a little while. And so I think that this also, it's not a new problem. Book challenges, I feel like, have been around for a long time, but we're definitely seeing more and more of it, and it's getting, kids need representation. And so I think that's the biggest thing that we have to remember.
There is a great deal of wonderful comments that are in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute and talk?
Yeah, Brooke, so you mentioned I was the little kid that did not like reading because I got bad reading scores. Because we were reading all the, because of Winn-Dixie and the issued books from the state. And in middle school, it was going to the Scholastic Book Fair and having my middle school teacher point out a book to me and be like, I think you'd be really interested in this one. And like, I remember she gave me, like, I didn't have enough money. She gave me a little bit to help me like buy it, like it meant the world. And I couldn't get my nose out of a book after that.
Yeah.
How do you sort of advise, you mentioned trying to find those resources to meet the needs, doing inter-surveys, things like that. How do you sort of help your students figure out what books would be for them, especially if they're not really avid readers?
So that's a great question. So I would say I approach this kind of a two-pronged approach. There are books out there, and so, quote, the reading level of a student may or may not allow them to read. The reading skills, I would say, that a student possesses may or may not allow them to read all books that they're interested in independently. But I also feel like that we have lots of resources in audiobooks and all of that, and I'm not against those at all, for letting students use those. But I think asking students, knowing what they're interested in. And then as a teacher, I feel like you kind of have to do your homework. I mean, you've got to be fairly literate yourself and know what's out there in terms of if you're, middle, secondary, adolescent literature, what's out there, even nonfiction, memoirs, things that might appeal to kids as well. So not just, a fictional account of something that they may want to read. And if you're not, if you're not a teacher who is well versed in, literature, I would also, I am a big fan of School Library Journal, their sites. I'm a big fan of the Horn Book, their site as well, that you can oftentimes search topics, search different things and books that will come up. And so I like to use those sources. I think some of our librarians, many of them are as well. They know a lot depending on where they are on this topic as well. So I think that sometimes they're a resource and sometimes they're not, just being honest. But I think if you know that in your school, I think if you know that you have a media specialist who is kind of all about building an inclusive school library as well, then that person as well is going to be a good resource for kids. And that's just another adult in the building that a kid can build a relationship with as well, which I think is an awesome thing. If you have a colleague that is really well-versed in literature, send that kid their way as well. Again, I don't think we always have to be the experts for our students.
Other voices. I saw people unmute and mute, and I see things popping up in the chat.
So Brooke, I have a question. In thinking about schools and the teachers that are like, okay, I don't want to deal with a banned book. I don't know how to handle a challenge, especially, if it's a teacher of color or from a marginalized population, that there's even more concern to be able to do this. So I'm curious as to what you think the role is for administration and access to these books that might be considered controversial.
And you're talking, I guess, school level, building level administration. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that administrators, so I often hear admins say, we're going to do what's best for kids. And so to me, if you're going to do what's best for kids, then this is what's best for kids. Because as I've said, I feel like having access to books, all kids should have access to something that they want to read and something that they're interested. All kids should have access to books that reflect their experiences. And so I think as an administrator, you got to have a backbone with that. And so if you say that you are doing what's best for all students in the school, then I think that's not and again, I feel like this is a classroom library. So, you're not necessarily forcing every student to read all books, but there's access to the books. And so if student chooses to select the book, then that's their choice. And not everyone has to choose that. I feel like it's kind of like a menu, I'm not a huge fan of fast food, yet I pass by them all the time. But they're there. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Other thoughts, questions? I have a ton of questions for you, Brooke, but I'll say those in thinking about the time that we have on the call. So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like. Sometimes we have this belief that that could never happen here. And it's just those places that have these events. And that came front and center recently with the South Carolina Transparency Act. Now, most of our talk has been about South Carolina. I'll talk next slide about the fact that that's really null and void. But we are given opportunities to think about these policies and legislation and these acts in our lives, and we're given opportunities to figure out how will we deal with these situations. You know, I'm a pre-service educator. I do PD, you know, with practicing teachers, and the South Carolina Transparency Act that was that came up at the, you know, this last academic year, in higher ed, it had some ripples, but for the most part, our institution indicated that we are in higher ed, not K-12. So it doesn't impact us, it only impacts K-12. And to that, we said, our students are coming from K-12 to here. So that's problematic, that logic. For those of you that are not well-versed in sorting through the bills, this was an act that sought to ban or you know, prohibit the teaching of concepts like race, religion, politics, gender identity, sexual orientation. To address this, at my institution, we had a call where we brought in students from different backgrounds to talk about what this meant for them. Our students in our program, many said, you know, this is something that you all need to have a voice about. And so as a white cisgender male, as an academic, one of the things that it was a call to me and many of my colleagues is that we need to do something about this. This is not normal. This is not right. And so we've started that process. And I know that in the state of South Carolina, there's other institutions that are trying to figure out their footing as well. They're trying to figure out, what do we do? What do we say? What should we say? One of the things to keep in mind is that, like I said before, this is not new. We'd like to believe that this is just, you know, I have friends and family that would indicate, or the media would suggest, that this is concerned parents, or they feel like things are out of control, so they want to try and have some control brought. But the truth of the matter is that this is a wave. This is sweeping legislation that's going across the United States. It's heading globally as well. A lot of this is well funded, well organized. One of the really interesting pieces is, and I'll share this spreadsheet. This is from our colleagues. I always share this from our colleagues at USC, that these bills are coming across the US. Okay, so this is not new. I'll put this in the chat because I see people trying to eyeball it. No, this is not new. This is not a surprise. This is well organized, well funded. There are groups that are making decisions to push levers and push for these policies. And what we are identifying them as anti-truth legislation. And this goes exactly to what Tori was talking about, exactly what Brooke was talking about. This is really trying to restrict what students are learning, what teachers are teaching, and try to go to some biased or incorrect or other form of truth that might be out there. There are ways to fight this, but we're still trying to figure out how we fight this, if we choose to fight these things. And so I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about what we could possibly do, but I wanted to provide space for people to talk about any of this if they wanted to.
I just wanted to ask if South Carolina gets some sort of award for having 7 different bills about it. I saw multiple states only have 1, but South Carolina on the spreadsheet has 7. Well, technically 8 because the House and Senate bill together. But the censorship that they're talking about, of course, affects the demographic of students that I teach with multilingual learners, because there are some hard truths that come from literature or from the history of these students. And so they're not able to connect with a lot of the things that they're hearing in American classrooms because nothing reflects their experiences. And so that's one more issue of censorship, I guess, for my students.
Absolutely. Heather, you shared something in the chat and it's always good to hear your voice. So I want to give you space if you wanted to unmute and say anything.
Hey y'all, yeah, this is it was filed, I think, in April, and it's against Charleston County School District, specifically targeting literacy in the EL curriculum, which the school district, I don't know if this is related, but they met Monday and they decided to no longer, after putting like millions of dollars and 2 years of training educators in using EL, they decided to no longer use it after this lawsuit was filed. So, you know, I mean, I want to think like, you know, it's just people like filing lawsuits for whatever reason, but then all of a sudden EL, after so much money was put in, is being dropped by our entire district all of a sudden.
Can you explain a little bit about EL and some of the Charleston County is a very specific and wonderful petri dish. So can you explain a little bit of what's happening?
Well, y'all probably know the EL curriculum because I think it's one of the top choices used nationwide right now in districts, especially in low performing schools. But it is an English language curriculum that does support, it's not like all diversity, but it incorporates, you know, it's kind of up to date a bit in incorporating different voices, being culturally responsive. And it's seen a lot of success in lower performing schools. I think it's one of the top choices being used across the country right now. So our school district adopted it, put, you know, maybe 3 years into training educators and maybe spent 60 million over the past 3 years. And just this Monday said, we're not going to use it anymore. We're going to pick a new curriculum. And the school board members were talking about curriculum and they didn't even have like the definition of curriculum like stated properly. Like they had no idea what they were talking about, but they were like, this EL's gone and it's gone. The school district won't use it anymore. So, I mean, y'all probably know EL. I'm sure everybody here has probably, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that we assume, you know, we assume best interest of other individuals in these discussions, and I don't think that we can do that. You know, taking a step forward, one of the things I was thinking about as Tori was talking about, and wanted to ask Brooke as well is, you know, I work with pre-service teachers, or work with teachers in the classroom, and you know, a lot of my pre-service teachers, especially, you know, to Rochelle's question earlier, do students want this? A lot of my pre-service teachers say they want to be able to teach this, but they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of saying something or being doxxed or outed or fired. So, you know, I'll hold that question in the parking lot for a minute. You know, so what could we do when we think about this? One of the things we want to think about is, what are we doing? Is this an issue, or is this an opportunity for representation? Are we trying to speak for others? Are we trying to mobilize? Are we trying to speak with others? We, with the local school district outside of our institution, we've had several instances where we've, you know, my department has sought to speak with the educators there, but that becomes problematic. But then perhaps are we looking to speak for others, or speak by and empower others? And so this is one of the decisions where we need to think about our power and privilege and identity, and how, you know, do we choose to leverage that to support others? How do we get this done? This is something that I am slowly learning over the last year. I'm trying to use alliances and roles and responsibilities that I have to make connections. So it's getting to know the key players. It's identifying here in the state of South Carolina, it's talking to SCEA and PSTA, and talking to groups that are doing this work, and aligning with ACLU, aligning with other groups to try and figure out, okay, legally, where do we stand on these things? know the policymakers. One of the things that knowing the policymaker, but also using media strategically and the art of good timing. With the Transparency Act, I was, and a lot of my colleagues were terrified of this being of this working its way through. And one of the things that we realized is that there are people that are legislator whisperers. They know when things are posturing and when things are serious. And so as things were going through, I had colleagues and friends that were saying, don't worry about this one. This is just them posturing. It's, you know, it's so late in the cycle, it'll never pass. That did nothing to allay concerns, but I think it's important to have people that know the policymakers, know the key players. A lot of this is also, we need to do our homework as educators. We need to research this and get updates on policy and understand what's going on and who the key players are and learn how the game is played, anticipating arguments from the opposition. That's why I really value what Tori and Brooke have said so far. It's talking to individuals that are regularly in these discussions. They are in they're in the arena, getting into dialogue and possibly arguments with others to understand what is the pushback from other individuals. But then also I believe in creating alliances. I believe in making those connections between the unions and other players. So creating a big tent, trying to bring people together so that everybody can contribute, everybody can benefit. Agreed action, there's a difference between the individual and the collaborative. We're not going to get everything we want, but we are stronger together. There is a need for transparency because there's a lot of power. I've done research in the local area looking at activists and digital activists, and a lot of these networks build up a lot of steam and then fizzle out because organizers point the finger at others. But then there's also a need for dialogue and understanding where other people are coming from. And so I will stop talking because there's a lot of great discussions that are happening in our chat again, and I wanted to create space for some dialogue.
I want to thank the panel for how this was organized because we did have a lot of interaction and engagement throughout and questions that bubbled up for people, people that wanted to share. And so I thought this was such a nice way to talk about these ideas and push our thinking. So I do want to thank everybody.
I want to thank I want to thank Tori. I want to thank Brooke for the insight, but I also want to thank Tori for showing up and talking about this. There's a lot of risk involved in this, and I heard a little bit about Jamie's story before, but I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. It's inspiring. It reminds me of why we do what we do.
Well, if there
Any
aren't
other
questions,
thoughts, comments? Everybody gets all quiet now. This is awkward.
so we will post the recording on our website. You can reach out to anybody here if the panelists want to plop their the best way to communicate with them, whether it's email, social media, whatever it may be. If you have questions or follow-up you want to do, as well as there will be a blog post shared. Tori's was shared already, and I was not prepared and didn't have our website, but hers was shared, and so you can find that already on our webpage. Whoops. What a girl. And then I was saying what I said, I started to type. It's the actual link, not the other part. But Brooks is coming up, Ian's is coming up, as well as Jamie has one coming up. So please make sure that you are liking and sharing those posts with other people. And if there are people in your schools or in your settings that you think are interested in sharing their voice in various topics for our blog, please reach out as well. But this is a great session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.